Okay, Joe, so whose crappy video will we be tortured with today?
Yeah, is it a wacko Paul hater or another fundy atheist?
Well, guys, we're in luck because it's another fundy atheist. Today we'll be watching a guy named Steve Shives and part 4 of his series where he reads Lee Strobel's Case for Christ.
You sure have a funny idea what it means to be lucky.
Well, it's lucky because we can usually get a few laughs out of these guys when they're dealing with the secular references to Jesus, like Tacitus and Josephus.
Yeah, that's true. The ignorance of these guys can really stand out on that topic.
Yeah, if you say so. I'd still rather be ejected into space. Isn't that thing something like 300 hours long?
No, just 35 minutes. But we're going to skip over a few parts of it where Steve rambles and whines about trivial stuff, and concentrate on his arguments.
So, out of that 35 minutes, what's left? 12 seconds?
That's very funny, Tim. Let's get started, shall we?
Strobel asks Yamauchi then how much information there is about Jesus from outside the Gospels, from outside the Bible in general. And Yamauchi
Hey, look, guys, he
Josephus
uses
and
Vogue
Tacitus,
magazine as scholarship.
And he claims that Jesus made more of an impression in history
Yeah, well,
than
you
any
make an
other
impression every time you
contemporary
fall flat
figure.
on your face
That
making
we hear
arguments.
more about Jesus than we hear about Herod the Great or Pontius Pilate, and we usually only hear about them in terms of their relation to the Jesus story.
Hey, you think
And
he's done
Yamauchi
coloring
says,
all those
Jesus
books on the shelf behind
did
him?
make an impression on those who believed in him. He did not, of course, among those who did not believe in him. And I found this an odd thing for Yamauchi to say, because if his miracles and his resurrection were true events that actually happened, wouldn't Jesus have made a much, much larger impression on a much wider group of people than he actually did? Why?
No, because
would
like
he
the man
only have
said,
made
those
an
are people who
impression
didn't believe
on
in
his
what he
followers?
did.
Testimony by a traitor. Yamauchi starts talking about Josephus, and he describes Josephus as an important first-century Jewish philosopher. He was born in AD 37, after the
My
life of
IQ is
Christ.
going down to
All of these
37
extra
just watching
Christian
this
sources
crap.
come from after, and in many cases long after, decades or even centuries after.
Yeah, so
the life
what?
of
All
Christ.
these guys write about events that
Just so we
happened
have that
decades
out there,
earlier, not
that
just
they
stuff
don't go out
about
of their way to
Jesus.
mention that. In his book, The Antiquities, Josephus describes how the Jewish high priest Ananias called a meeting of the Sanhedrin and had James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, stoned to death. And Yamauchi
I'll bet that's not the
trumpets
only
this
thing
passage,
stoned around here.
which he says has never been successfully
Hey, I'll bet he bought his
disputed by any
copy of the
scholar,
Antiquities from
as
Fred
a
Sanford.
very important reference to the brother of Jesus and a corroboration of the fact that some people believe Jesus to be the Christ, which means the anointed one or the Messiah. Yamauchi comes to reference to Jesus in Josephus that is popularly known as the Testimonium Flavianum. And this is a quote from the Antiquities that is considered a very important reference to Jesus. I think the most important reference to Jesus in Josephus.
Well, there's only two
Strobel
references, so you
asks
sure
whether
have
or
to be a
not
brain
the
trust to figure
Testimonium
that one out.
Flavianum is authentic, or if it's been doctored by others to craft a more positive, favorable view of Jesus. And Yamauchi says that the passage is fascinating but controversial. But let's think about that passage without those three interpolations, because if you take away if indeed one ought to call him a man, he was the Christ, and on the third day he appeared to them restored to life, what you're left with is a passage that only corroborates the existence of Jesus.
Yeah, and that's what Strobel's chapter is all about, Steve.
That surrounded him and came after him. It does nothing to corroborate the most incredible claims found in the Gospels.
Yeah, and if
The
it did, you
miracles,
just said
the
Josephus was
resurrection.
being a
It's
superstitious
not a
moron,
corroboration
too.
of any of that. It corroborates the parts about the Jesus story that are the easiest to believe. But one thing that it does establish very nicely is the willingness of early Christians to falsify documents in order to promote their version of the Jesus story. Lee Strobel wonders why Josephus doesn't mention Jesus more often than he does if Jesus was such an important figure. And Yamauchi's answer to this is, well, Josephus was more interested in politics and in the struggle of the Jews against the Romans, and Jesus just wasn't very important to that struggle. So someone like John the Baptist, who Josephus mentions more often in his work, more prominently than Jesus, would have been more important to him than Jesus would have been. So that's why Josephus only mentions Jesus a few times.
Say what? Josephus only mentions John the Baptist once and Jesus twice.
Bruce Metzger and Craig Blomberg. And he asks him whether or not Jesus was a zealot, or at least sympathetic to the zealots, the anti-Roman movement in the Jewish community. And Yamauchi handles this very easily, just as Strobel had intended him to. And now we move on from Josephus to the other big extra-biblical source for Jesus, which is
hey, you notice he has to look it up to
This
know what
section
it
called
is.
A most mischievous superstition. Yamauchi describes the reference in Tacitus to Jesus as, quote, the most important reference to Jesus outside the New Testament. So what does Tacitus say about Jesus? Yamauchi claims that that passage from Tacitus establishes that crucifixion was, quote, the most abhorrent fate that anyone could undergo, and the fact that there was a movement based on a crucified man has to be explained. And he says, quote, how can you explain the spread of a religion based on the worship of a man who had suffered the most ignominious death possible? Of course, the Christian answer is that he was resurrected. Others have to come up with some alternative theory if they don't believe that, but none of the alternative views, to my mind, are very persuasive. Note, if you will, how Yamauchi shifts the burden of proof there onto the people who don't believe.
Well, yeah, Steve, that's because people like you don't know diddly squat about crucifixion in an honor and shame society.
To explain Christianity, if the resurrection did not actually happen, how about this? People believed that Jesus had been resurrected and that he was coming back. You know, followers of religious movements are not always as easily dissuaded as Yamauchi seems to want us to think. Now we move on to the next section, which is titled Chanting as If to a God. And here we deal
Maybe
with
if we chant loud enough, we can drown this guy. Let's do it.
Pliny the Younger. Pliny the Younger was the governor of a Roman province called Bithynia, which was a province of Turkey, actually, in the early 2nd
forget it, it doesn't work.
The emperor at the time, Emperor Trajan. His letters are called the Epistulae, and his letters to Emperor Trajan contain references to the early Christians. Yamauchi reads one of those, which was probably written in the year 111, and it says, quote, "The day the earth went dark." I really like this section. Here Strobel brings up the so-called crucifixion darkness, or the crucifixion eclipse. Three of the Gospels, the three synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, claim that the sky went dark for 3 hours from about noon till about 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
Noon to 3? That's almost as long as this stinking video.
And Strobel and Yamauchi discuss a quotation of Thallus by Julius Africanus in AD 221. Thallus apparently attributed the crucifixion darkness to an eclipse, but Africanus argues that it couldn't have been an eclipse. And then Yamauchi reads a quote from Paul Meyer's book, Pontius Pilate, that cites references from Tertullian and Phlegon, both of whom were writing over a century after the fact, that mention that an
there he
eclipse of
goes
the
again
sun
with that
was
written
seen
later
throughout
crap.
the region.
Don't give him a
References
modern
that we
history of the
find
Civil
in
War.
writers like Tertullian and Phlegon to an eclipse that was visible in the Middle East around the year AD 33 makes sense, because there was a total solar eclipse in AD 33 that was visible from the Middle East. Yamauchi mentions that the Talmud describes Jesus as a false Messiah who practiced magic and was put to a just death for his blasphemy.
They could have put anyone to death by
And
making them watch this video.
that Jesus was actually the child of a Roman soldier and Mary, which Yamauchi takes as a confirmation that there was something unusual about the birth of Jesus, which is just a shocking example of confirmation bias.
Yeah, well, this guy's a shocking example of just about everything.
Jesus was the product of God and Mary. And the Talmud says, it's probably just a rumor, but so what? The Talmud says he was probably the product of a Roman soldier and Mary. And Yamauchi says, see, corroboration. They both agree that there was something unusual about his birth. Evidence apart from the Bible is the next section. Strobel asks Yamauchi, why aren't there even more references to Jesus outside of the New Testament than the ones we find? And first, Yamauchi kind of talks out of both sides of his mouth here. First, he hedges his bet by saying that, well, often when religious movements begin, they won't really gather much attention, and people won't record things about them until many generations after they were started.
That's not hedging his bet, that's historical fact.
But then he also claims that the references that we do find to Jesus are actually so much better than the references we find to other ancient religious figures. For instance, he mentions the long intervals between the lifetimes and the recording of the scriptures or the biographies of Zoroaster and Buddha and Muhammad, compared to the relatively short interval between the life of Jesus and the writing of the New Testament. But remember the earlier chapters we talked about? Didn't Craig Blomberg say that we should be able to trust oral traditions? Does it really matter what the interval was between the life of Zoroaster and the writing of the Gathas of Zoroaster? In other words, see, they mention all these facts we would know about Jesus as though this is really important, but really we would only know the most general facts about Jesus himself and
yeah, but
a
the
few
point
more
is, Christ mythos deny
equally
even
general
those facts. Don't you
details
get this?
about the people in the cult that grew up around Jesus that eventually evolved into the Christian church. I mean, I can't see how any of these details. I mean, if your thesis is that there never was a historical Jesus, and a lot of people make that argument, and I actually
That's
think
what
it's a
that chapter
compelling
is for,
argument, even though it's not
dude.
really my view. It might be somewhat persuasive against that argument, but even if you convince people that there was a historical Jesus, that he was a Jewish teacher, that he did have followers who believed he was the Messiah, etc., you still have a long way to go before you can convince people that they ought to be one of those followers. We move on to the next section, corroborating early details. Strobel prompts Yamauchi to talk about the Pauline epistles, which he also presents as important evidence for Jesus from outside the Gospels, even though they are part of the New Testament. They're outside the Gospels, so he
You do
counts
know the New
those as
Testament isn't just one book,
extra
right?
sources. They mention that Paul's writing is the earliest that we have in the New Testament. It predates the Gospels. And they talk about Paul's focus on the resurrection of Jesus and the atonement of Jesus, and how Paul doesn't really make references to Jesus' parables or Jesus' miracles. And to Yamauchi, this indicates that that atonement and resurrection element of Jesus' ministry were of the greatest importance to Paul. But couldn't that also indicate that Paul just was simply unaware of the stories of the parables or the miracles?
No, it doesn't. Look up high
He was
context
writing
society.
so early that those elements had not yet entered the narrative? My question is, why should I care about anything that Ignatius says? Everything he says is
Why
hearsay.
should we care what
He's
the guy in
writing
a
long
baseball
after
hat
the
has to
events
say about
supposedly took
biblical
place. He's not an
scholarship?
eyewitness. He's not basing anything he says on eyewitnesses, because we've already established that most of the Gospels cannot be counted as eyewitness testimony. So, and also, the early church leaders, the apostolic fathers, are these the same people who falsified Josephus and added verses to the Gospels to suit their own purposes? Why are they good sources? Now we have another example toward the end of this section of Strobel's tough objective journalism. He says, quote, "Put all this together, Josephus, the Roman historians and officials, the Jewish writings, the letters of Paul,
Let's
and
get
the
out of here
apostolic
before my
fathers,
brain turns to
and
mush.
you've got
Okay,
persuasive
boys, let's
evidence
sign
that
off with a good
corroborates
theme for
all the
this junk.
essentials found in the biographies of Jesus. Even if you were to throw away every last copy of the Gospels, you'd still have a picture of Jesus that's extremely good. Son of God. Look, this is
So, boys, what did you think of that one?
Oh man, that was more tedious than watching paint flake off a wall. Almost no arguments and just a bunch of funny atheist sound bites we've seen 100 times before.
Yeah, that was ridiculous. Who actually watches any of that stuff, Joe?
Well, we do, that's for sure. See you next time.